and that then turned us back to children. But amongst her recent curatorial projects were the feminine and abstract painting, and Godzilla echoes from the 1980s American architecture. Clearly a bit off to the side. I know she's going to be speaking about today. But Jennifer Samet on Jean Reno.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Erin. So nice to be here. Is the volume okay? Or should I bring it up? Thank you. How's that? Is that better? Okay, great. Thanks for being here. I am, yes, as Lisa was mentioning, when we spoke for the first time and she told me about the title for the conference, Crafting the Dream, I hadn't even necessarily come in with an idea, but I thought as soon as you told me the title, I thought this is so perfect to speak about Jean Reno, and hopefully this will become clear as I speak. And I just wanted to mention that at Eric Firestone Gallery, where I'm director, we represent Jean Reno's estate, and this is a catalog that we published a few years ago, and it's in the folder in the bibliography in case you would like to get a copy from the gallery. And there's also a short film about her that's available on our website that you can find. Okay. Jean Reno, who was born in 1903 and died in 1983, was a mosaicist and a first-generation New York school artist. Her work was largely abstract, and she was dedicated to the ways in which hand-cut stones and glass tiles set on a bias could reflect and create light across a surface. She applied tesserae, which Kathleen has defined for you, the tiles, stone, and shells that she used to construct her mosaics in loose formations to a ground of pigmented cement. I like to think about how beauty and danger coexist in Jean Reno's work. As an artist formed by her surrealist milieu, and this has been nicely set up with earlier presentations today, she was conscious of the charge garnered from harnessing these opposing forces. Her surfaces sparkle, ebb, and flow like topographies kissed by the elements. In order to convey these temporal realities, Reno placed, as you can see in this image, Reno placed every stone, tile, and tesserae into pigmented cement on a bias. Their sharp edges project out from the surfaces like a reminder that this work will not always sit still and behave. From a young age, Reno was conscious that she would not conform to societal and familial expectations. She was born into a wealthy family. Her mother was Adele Fitzgerald and her father, Eugene Suni Reno. The notes that Reno made for an autobiography, and which are in her archives, make clear the tensions she felt as a young girl and her often antagonistic relationship with her parents. She was educated completely by private tutors. She traveled extensively as a young person, but went nowhere without a chaperone. Her father was known to be a severe aristocratic person who hunted and raised beagles. But from him, Reno inherited a love of animals and riding horses, And most importantly, she developed an adventurous spirit, a quality her mosaics radiate with in both their aesthetic and technique. In 1927, Raynal was injured in a riding accident and was sent to England to recuperate, which would set in motion the almost happenstance events leading to her work with Mosaic. At a dinner party hosted by art collectors in London, she met the Russian mosaicist Boris Anrep. Knowing that Raynal was on her way to Italy, Anrep encouraged her to visit mosaics in Torcello and Murano. By 1930, Raynal had joined Anrep in Paris, where he was working on commissions for the floors of the Bank of England and the Greek church at Bayswater. A worker in Anrep's atelier became sick, and Raynal was invited to take his place. Raynal would spend the next 8 years as Anrep's apprentice. By the time that she returned to the United States in 1938, Raynal was resolved to create what she said was a new art of mosaic, a contemporary and fresh look for this ancient medium. This goal was Raynal's catalyst, driving her experimentation. Perhaps most importantly, she let go of the traditional reverse method of creating mosaics, which Kathleen also touched upon, in which stones were first glued to paper in a specific formation before being transferred. Raynal would work directly, as you could see in that, in this image, by adding stones into the wet cement she mixed with powdered pigment. And you can see that she's working with her husband here, Thomas Sills, who was an important painter as well. Extemporaneity, freedom, and intuition were hallmarks of Raynal's process, leading to unexpected singular work that radically challenges our expectations of mosaic. Raynal hand-cut all of her tesserae, and you could see that here, the mosaic tiles, which were a mix of traditional Venetian glass, semi-precious stones, and pieces of shell. Next, she prepared a surface of pigmented cement and then scattered or seeded the tiles loosely before using a leather hammer to embed them. Hand-cutting the tesserae would result in leftover dust from the cutting of the glass, and she incorporated this dust by spreading it over the work. While in Paris, Raynal met and began to develop important friendships with Marcel Duchamp and the Surrealist poets and painters, including André Breton and his wife Elise. This milieu formed the basis of how Raynal would conceptualize her work. Breton, who was a trained psychiatrist, published the Manifesto of Surrealism in 1924, advocating using free association and automatism to draw upon dreams and the private world of the mind. The resulting unexpected imagery served as a rejection of tradition. The tenets of Surrealism must have resonated with Raynal in terms of their desire to shed societal constructs and conscious control. Raynal's personal life was informed by her bold rebellion from these very societal expectations. As a young woman, Raynal's relationship with Anrep, which had developed into an affair, resulted in being cut off from an allowance from her father. Duchamp's major work, Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors Even, The Large Glass, is considered an important precursor to Surrealism with its suggestions of child's play mixed with erotically charged forms, chance procedures, and a complete rethinking of material process. And Raynal later acquired Duchamp's first perspectival study for The Large Glass in 1913 drawing. For Raynal, mosaic became the alternate material, and to apply to tenets of automatism meant re-examining how mosaics were made. In 1938, Raynal returned to the United States and many surrealists emigrated to the country as well at the onset of the Second World War. Reynal made a home for herself in San Francisco at this time and began to develop her early work outside of the UNREP atelier. Go back to that one. Her 1940s mosaic utilized a relatively structured composition and a flat placement of larger square tiles. This piece, equation number 2, was among the works included in Reynal's 1941 exhibition at the San Francisco Museum of Art, now San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. By this time, both of her parents had passed, and Reynal's inheritance allowed her financial and emotional freedom to fully pursue her work and her support of other artist friends. In a journal entry, Reynal writes, "At first I was afraid of all of this money, quite a generous amount, but soon I found out that I could help my friends with it. Their needs were very similar to mine. Food, material, a place to work was all that was needed." This was earlier. Sorry, these are a tiny bit out of order. She acquired a 1941 Jackson Pollock painting from Peggy Guggenheim's gallery. It was the first notable sale of a Pollock. At this time, Reynal developed a relationship with the first director of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, who happened to be a woman, Grace McCann Morley. And Reynal introduced Morley to the work of Pollock and counseled her on other artists emerging in New York, such as Arshile Gorky, profoundly impacting the course of acquisitions and exhibitions at the museum. In this period, Reynal made mosaics more rooted in their functional decorative tradition. She created mosaic tabletops and mantelpiece decorations, along with a mosaic floor here, great field of hands, in the outdoor garden of her companion Frederick Thompson's property in Stinson Beach, California. During her California years, Reynal also developed a lifelong friendship with Isamu Noguchi, who had enrolled voluntarily in an internment camp to aid other Japanese Americans. And she collaborated with Noguchi on several mosaics for tables of his design. Her inheritance also allowed her to build a small house in Soda Springs, California, in the High Sierras, and it's likely that some of the stones that she used, such as obsidian, come from the volcanic earth of that region. In 1946, Reynal went on a trip with André and Alyssa Breton through the Southwest United States, visiting Hopi, Zuni, and Navajo reservations. Reynal describes this experience and the influence of Navajo sand painting as formative in the development of her work. She says, "I will never forget a 6-week visit among the Navajos in New Mexico, watching them create their images from dawn until sunset by dribbling colored sands through their palms and closed fingers and varying the thickness of their lines according to how much they let their fingers open. So great was their concentration and so involved were they in their work that they made very few errors and correction was virtually unnecessary. When sunset came, they wiped the whole thing out. From that moving experience, I learned to cut my material very small, whether it be minerals gathered in the desert, smalty from Venice, or marbles or pumices from around the world. I discovered incidentally that the dust made in the cutting of stones or tesserae is of great use in intensifying background color. Indigenous art was of great interest to the surrealists, and for Reynal, it was an example of how intuition and spontaneity could permeate her handling of tesserae. In 1946, Reynal returned to New York, and in 1947, her work was included in the infamous Blood Flames exhibition at the Hugo Gallery, shown alongside the work of Wilfredo Lam, Roberto Mata, Noguchi, and Gorky, among others. The environment was designed by the radically innovative Swiss architect Frederick Kiesler, who created boomerang-shaped works, which you can see in this image for Reynal's work. The following year, Raynal was the subject of a solo exhibition at Julian Levy Gallery, another connection to this conference, which was wonderful. And her work from this period, such as Young Friends, 1949, utilizes the closely grouped tesserae, often from precious and semi-precious stones, where the outlines of anthropomorphic forms are captured as glittering lights and shadows. These works, often smaller in scale than the work of hers which would follow, were about discovery, the finding of form through a tactile, intimate process. By the 1950s, Raynal was committed to using even smaller tesserae, influenced by the Navajo sand painting, and also the use of very small stones was suggested by Gorky, who, along with his wife, Agnes, known as Magruder, had become very close friends of Raynal. Her 1950s work, such as Icarus Returns and The Blue Window, unite a few major pictorial concerns. In her attempt to free Mosaic from the traditional associations with architectural decoration, she works in a scale associated with painting and creates open, breathing forms across the surface. The curving biomorphic forms are associative but open-ended, evoking figures, flora, animals, or motion. Secondly, Raynal allows the surface to be as much about the pigmented cement as it is about the tesserae. She leaves areas without any tesserae at all, instead creating color forms with troweled sorrel cement. Thirdly, Raynal establishes her work as rooted in the earth. The surfaces themselves are suggestive of topographies. The loose scattering of tesserae evokes the experience of walking on the earth and how ever shifting a terrain can be. The very inclusion of hand-cut glass and stones collected on travels, embedded in a way that they thrust themselves towards us, is the concrete reminder that this all comes from the ground. In this way, Raynal asserts her connection to painting, but also differentiates herself. While painting is an act that suggests a kind of alchemy, pigment, colored dirt turned to image, Raynal asserts that the earth as fundamental. Occasionally, she leaves whole larger pieces of stone, particularly the chunks of obsidian, as this signifier. The 1950s mosaics, such as Now is Winter and the Stallion Oat, are rooted in mystery. We sense the presence of certain elements, but these suggestions are left as open as the breathing forms themselves. Raynal connects herself to the experience of observing Byzantine mosaics in dimly lit churches with ever-changing patterns of illumination. By 1959, fields of primary monochromes replaced the somber earth tones of her earlier work. To achieve this, Raynal began using Portland cement, which gave her a whiter ground as the starting point. Raynal's work became about the overall field, the shape of the support, and the play of light across these surfaces. I think of these as all over works in the sense of abstract expressionism or color field paintings. In 1959, Raynal made Songs of the Tiwa a monumental hexagonal composition and Rain Shadow a diamond shape. They were exhibited at Betty Parsons' gallery. These works were ahead of their time in terms of the interest in shaped supports, which developed in the art world in the late 1960s and 70s. Raynal's work with shaped supports led her in a new direction. Free form We'll get there. Freeform disc mosaics. These, along with her shaped pieces, were exhibited twice in 1961. The first show was hosted by NYU Loeb Student Center, and the second was held outdoors on the property of sculptor Sidney Wolfson in Millbrook, New York. Marcel Breuer designed Wolfson's home, which incorporated a trailer into its structure. Reynal was connected to the area because she lived there with her father after her parents had separated, spending time there riding horses. The setting reinforced the idea of the temporal and the impermanent. It also provided an opportunity to explore the interaction between the mosaics and the outdoor landscape. Some discs were supported by natural rocks away from walls. Outside, light was constantly shifting and indirect. The surfaces became receptacles for light. Others were freestanding and double-sided. As Reynal worked with this shape, the discs gradually developed into concave and convex forms. In the early part of her career, Reynal was concerned about how her mosaic work was categorized. This came up particularly in relation when she was involved with and showing in San Francisco. She saw her 1940s and 50s work as painting in stone, and she worked with complex figure-ground relationships and the organization of forms. But by the 1960s, she moved more comfortably into the idea of mosaic as sculpture. In this way, untethering mosaic from the walls or its function as decorating surfaces. Her 1969 to 1971 totems are bold statements of the possibilities for the medium. She takes the craggy folds of her troweled cement into 3 dimensions. With undulating columns, some more than 10 feet tall, she incorporates larger mother of pearl pieces. In the 1950s, abstract expressionists had intentionally freed painting from the limitations of the easel. Painting was theorized as an arena in which to act by Harold Rosenberg in the 50s. Reynal embraced this arena, including the weight, monumentality, and the labor-intensive process of construction. Reynal was an unafraid artist who continually reinvented her work. As her career progressed, her work grew more monumental, more intuitive, more experimental, and less attached to any preconceptions of the medium. In an autobiographical note, Reynal wrote, "Some of my best work comes from dreams. Others come while I work and dream. Anyone can gather that I am not an intellectual, but depend entirely on feelings and animality for my statements in art as well as life." Reynal, buoyed by the philosophy of surrealism and abstract expressionism, channeled these forces, intuition and animality. As a result, her work breathes with risk and daring, light and effervescence. Hers is a singular contribution. Thank you. This is an exhibition that's coming up in the fall, Miro in the United States, which actually includes 3 of the totems that I was showing at the end in Barcelona. Should we take any questions? Are we taking questions? Okay.
So the way we're going to do this, I have a few questions, and then we will throw it open to you for yours. But the first question that I was uh, very interested in is what about audience for each of these women? Who did they think of as their client, and who was going to view the work, and how were the decisions made in that respect?
Is this one on? Yes, it is. In the case of Hildreth Mier, because she did work, most of her work is in or on buildings, her client would be a combination of the architect and the ultimate client, whoever had commissioned the architect to design the building. So, for example, in the case of One Wall Street, it would be Voorhees, Gmelin, and Walker, and also the Irving Trust Company. So she took her cues. Oh, and in fact, I showed you the design at the AT&T building, the Continents. Originally, she proposed a different design. It was called A Day in the Life of the Telephone Girl. And she really, really liked it because it referred to these women who were taking jobs as telephone operators, and they were becoming cultural icons. And it showed a young woman waking up and having her coffee and getting dressed and going to her job at the AT&T building. And the AT&T officials just hated it. They said they wanted something more conventional. They wanted allegorical figures. And so she just turned around and came up with a new theme. So she was her client was the person who in essence was paying for the work, and she was very responsive to them.
So for Reynal, it's it's kind of I mean, Kathleen, you started your presentation asking who was familiar with Mier, and I think maybe Reynal is is going to be a similar response. Although I know there's a few people in the room who are familiar, but it's kind of amazing because she did really have an audience, and her work was shown. She was really in the center. I mean, she's the tiniest of footnotes in the Ninth Street Women book. Mentioned, I think, only because she hosted a party or something. Although, she was really in the center. She had a show at Julian Levy Gallery, which I showed you in 1948. She showed at the San Francisco Museum of Art in the early 40s. She showed with Betty Parsons later. And she was fortunate enough to be well connected because she was a patron, as I said, like in addition to being an artist. And so she had this wonderful way of she would buy work by her friends, Mata and Pollock, as I mentioned, and support all of these artists, Gorky. And she would also then place their work in museums. So she was really helping them more than just financially, but with their whole reception. And so her work as well is in great museum collections. It's in the Whitney Museum and in MoMA here in New York. And she, what? And in the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Thank you, Bob. Yes. But that's a recent acquisition. And she did do some public commissions, and I didn't get into this, but another wonderful connection with Mier is that she did 2 public commissions for the Nebraska State Capitol. I didn't get into all of this, but the first one, I think it was the first one, the public hated, and even like gathered there to basically boo her while she was making the mosaics because they were abstract. They were too abstract. They did represent a subject, which was a historic subject, a blizzard, and but it was too abstract for the people. But she persisted and ended up making another one, coming back to make another one. She really, she was totally fearless. So I hope that answers the question.
Well, you're sort of suggesting that she had a stealth approach to building a clientele in a way.
Mhm.
Yes, no. By helping her friends and thus enhancing her own network,
Yeah, I think
conversation.
I think that's fair to say. I think she was just really she was really in the center, which is why I mentioned, you know, just the tiniest of footnotes or kind of not being um known, but she was right in the middle of it with other artists and collectors and institutions.
So this segment was titled about linking sort of women and the modern.
Mhm.
But for each of them, they probably had rather different conception of modernity and the modern. And I'm wondering if you want to speak to that because I think it brings out perhaps further contrast and maybe similarity.
Yeah, I think I touched on maybe like some of the differences in terms of Reynal. I think Reynal was very concerned, especially earlier, as I said, with um, her work being categorized as painting and thought of as painting. She thought of them as paintings in stone, and that kind of informed the dimensions and the size of these works and the way that she was thinking of them. So she was kind of like freeing Mosaic from being part of architecture. So that's one way, and then I think the other ways in which she was thinking of the modern, as I discussed, were connecting it to surrealism, connecting it to abstract expressionism, perhaps, then connecting it to maybe minimalism or color field painting, which you can kind of see in those monochromatic works. So I think it was very much on her mind to make works that she considered modern, but also, contemporary.
And I think for Mier, the modern was more, as they called it at the time, modernistic, because she was more in the Art Deco era. She started, most of her commissions started coming in the late 20s and then into the 30s and into the 40s. And so she designed in more of an Art Deco aesthetic for most of her career. And some of them, you saw some of the allegorical figures that look, they're modern, but they're very classically inspired. But in other cases, she did incorporate elements of modernity like the telephone and the telegraph, but she did it with these allegorical figures. But I think in her hand, they become more fresh, they become modern, and she uses this very colorful Art Deco aesthetic. But I think it's also very interesting that, see if I can read my note here, that Jennifer mentioned that I think this was a quote from, it might have been a quote from right now. She took a contemporary and fresh look for this modern medium. And I showed a quote from Mier as well, and she talked about the modernity of Mosaic. So I think that's interesting that both of them looked on this this medium that goes back to ancient times, and they both thought it was a great medium to use in modern art or 20th century art.
Yes, that struck me when you showed that quote, that there is a real parallel to how they were speaking about it.
So in the interest of time, let's throw it open to you all. Any questions? Erica.
I think one way of thinking about the modern aspect of Reynolds Mosaic is that she refuses the DIY aesthetic of the domestic. And this is a time period where lots of women are painting on china and doing that kind of mosaic work, but she's not doing flower paint, right? She's not doing anything that says this is the work of a woman artist. And perhaps the post-war period. So I think that's one way. Like when you look at this mosaic here, unless you knew it was mosaic, you wouldn't know it was mosaic.
Mm-hmm.
It fits perfectly into that post-war realm. So it might be interesting to explore more gendered aspects of her artistic identity, especially with all the dad and mom stuff you mentioned.
Well, both of them actually, the
Yeah.
gender aspects and their self-conception.
Yeah, I do think of Reynal, as I said, as being really fearless. And part of that was, yeah, just letting go of a lot of gendered expectations. I mean, certainly the way that she was brought up, she wasn't being sent to school. She was going around with a chaperone. It was a very, very, kind of restrained upbringing, and I think that part of that is like gender norms and societal expectations of women, and I think that she just, but then her father gave her this kind of like adventurous spirit as well. So she really just turned a lot upside down. And I mean, I didn't like get into it so much in this presentation, but she ended up marrying an African American man from the South. And so there's a lot that she was just sort of turning over in terms of societal expectations. I also like sort of skipped through a couple of slides that went into when she went to the Texas Panhandle, because she started showing with a gallery, Dord Fitz, in Amarillo, Texas, and she ended up taking over kind of from Elaine de Kooning, the organization of this show called The Women, that was in 1960, I believe, or 61. This is all in the bibliography that you have. There's 2 books that get into that this subject. One is by Amy von Lintel and Bonnie Roos, 3 women artists, about abstract expressionism in the American West, and then Daniel Belasco, women artists in mid-century America, which talks about exhibitions of women artists, and he talks about that show. But yeah, I completely agree. I think she just radically overturned a lot of societal expectations, and by extension, expectations about what Mosaic was or could be. Please.
In terms of gender and Mier, she recognized that women artists faced more challenges than male artists. And in the case of mural painting, that even extended to physical challenges, because sometimes you had to get up on a scaffold. But she said that she never wanted to be known as a woman artist. She wanted to be known as an artist who just happened to be a woman. And when the Architectural League of New York opened their membership to women, she was one of the first members. And the organization wanted to have an exhibition of the work of their new women members. And she was adamantly against it. And she said, why don't you have an exhibition of the work of all the bald-headed members or all the members with red hair? That's just as legitimate as having an exhibition of the women members. I would say she wasn't a feminist. She admitted that.
Back there, please.
Hi.
Hi.
You guys have spoken a lot about sort of how they related to the tradition in terms of the content of their mosaics. I'm curious if you can speak about how they related to mosaic as a form, because my understanding is it fell out of favor for a time, and it was sort of revived, in this era. Yeah, basically, how did they sort of choose to use mosaic as such a primary art form? And, I love that quote about.
Okay. In some cases, not all, but in some cases, the client specified that, like at St. Bartholomew's. And also, there was a revival of mosaics going on at the time because of a lot of restoration work that was going on in Europe. So I think that might have contributed to it. But I think another thing is what we both brought out about the effect of light on mosaic. And in fact, Jennifer's presentation is Mosaic is Light. And I showed a quote from Mier. And so I think that was a factor too.
Yes, exactly. I think I mean, it was almost random that Reynal got involved with making mosaics. Like, just this, went to this dinner party, met Boris Anrep, the mosaicist, started apprenticing for him. But in that, but after all of that, I think she really connected to the medium, as Kathleen said, because of its ability to. Well, that's a quote of hers. Mosaic is light, and that's really, I think that's how she saw it, that it was this incredible form. And I mean, there's other things which I also got into as like just this signifier of the earth, her connection to like Navajo sand painting, all of these reasons that she really just connected um, to the material itself that became significant in terms of the ideas that she was thinking about in her work. And then it's kind of like my interpretation as well, that this combination of like beauty and danger, I mean, the work is literally sharp, like it has sharp edges. And I just think that there's something there as well, that like her psychology and who she was as a person and what she wanted to deal with in her work, that this medium was incredibly significant for that.
Marty, last question.
Yeah, my question was, while they had very different styles, they lived in the same period. Did they know each other, or is there any references that they had any connections from that standpoint?
I'd love to know the answer to
Yeah.
that question. I was talking about that earlier, and they moved in different circles because Reynal was friends with the modern artists. Mier was more in the architectural world, and but I don't know if I would love to know if they knew
Yeah.
each other or they knew of each other.
What are the dates of Mier's Nebraska commission?
Nebraska, she worked for about 8 years there, so from about 1924 to 32.
Okay, so it's much earlier. But she would have she would have seen them. They would have been there because Reynal did those in the 60s in Nebraska. I don't know the answer to that. But I haven't yet done a search in our archives for her name, which I can do.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
We are going to take a 15-minute break and then resume.